Remaking Middle School is launching a middle school listening tour. We want to know what comes to mind when you hear middle school. What do you think is and isn't working for middle school students today? What is the future of middle level education? If you are any of the following, a parent, a teacher, administrator, youth development professional, policymaker, or youth advocate of middle grade students, we would love to hear from you. There are two ways in which you can lend your voice to this project. You can complete an online survey. The survey will take about 10 minutes to complete. Or you can chat with a member of the Remaking Middle School team. Interviews take about 30 to 45 minutes of your time and can be done by phone or Zoom. If you're interested in sharing your perspective on middle school education, please visit remakingmiddleschool.org and click Sign Up for the listening tour. Hi, this is Jason Cascarino. Thanks for listening to the Lessons in Adolescence podcast, a production of the Remaking Middle School Initiative, whose founding partners include Youth-Nex, the University of Virginia's Center to Promote Effective Youth Development, and the Association for Middle Level Education, or AMLE. You can learn about Remaking Middle School on the web at remakingmiddleschool.org. Now, here's this episode. Hello and welcome to the Lessons in Adolescence podcast, where we explore the many facets that impact young adolescents in the middle school years, from the adverse to the awkward to the awesome. I'm your host, Jason Cascarino. Today, I talk with Daren Graves, Associate Professor of Education and Social Work at Simmons University, and Adjunct Lecturer of Education at Harvard Graduate School of Education. Daren's work centers on racial identity development among youth. His most recent work is Schooling for Critical Consciousness, which shows, quote, how schools can help Black and Latinx youth resist the negative effects of racial injustice and challenge its root causes, a circumstance that has some particular relevance to Daren's research focus on Black boys.
I happened to do a lot of work in a particular K-8 school, and it was just so fascinating and also heartbreaking to see some of the Black boys move from maybe even, kindergarten all the way up until like the 6th and 7th grade. Because they would start out as these cute, lovable little boys that everybody just adored. And then as they moved up, like the ways in which the adults around them like shifted their stance from these, lovable kids that, we wanted to help learn to like these bodies that we had to like control.
In part one of our conversation, Daren and I talk about the core features of racial identity development from the research literature, plus the concept of critical consciousness and what it means and does not mean in learning settings. In part two, we go into the adultification of Black boys and the resulting disproportionate representation in disciplinary incidents, how to best train pre-service teachers for a societal and educational landscape that is changing rapidly with respect to the racial composition of school-aged children, the intersection of racial identity development and social and emotional skill development, and the role of hip-hop in the education of youth of color. That's in just a little bit. Now, here's part one of my conversation with Daren Graves. Daren, it's so great having you on the podcast. Thanks for taking the time to join me.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
Well, I feel like we have so much ground to cover. I think it's fair to say that your research and your work are not focused exclusively on young adolescents in the middle grades, but the subject matter that you study and have influenced is highly relevant to young people at this age range and the caring adults who work with them in schools and in out of school settings and in community settings and in families, of course. First, let's just learn a little bit about you. You are Associate Professor of Education and Social Work at Simmons University in Boston and also an adjunct lecturer at the Harvard School of Education. Your research and teaching, as well as your other work, I know you consult and you do speaking engagements, are centered on the development of racial identities. Were you drawn to the subject matter as you pursued your own education, or were there life experiences that influenced your path? What compelled you to make this your life's work?
Yeah, I think for me, growing up as a Black man or young man in predominantly white institutions and schools, I grew up in suburban Connecticut, I went to Yale University, Harvard, graduate school education. I think those experiences, very much made me think about my racial identity between just the ways that other peers interacted with me or not. And I think also, and some of it took some of my parents' help, especially my mom's help, to perceive some of this, but also some of the ways my teachers perceived me and interacted with me or not. It's interesting because I think a lot of folks, when they hear that I sort of grew up in sort of suburban schools, elite kind of institutions, they sort of imagine a really sort of amazing educational experience. In a lot of ways it was, but there was a lot of challenges, a lot of pushback, a lot of questioning about my intellectual capabilities, dealing with other stereotypes, negative stereotypes around Blackness, often, again, surrounded around, issues around intellectual capabilities. I saw myself as a very curious, intelligent, dutiful student. For me, I was able to see a disconnect between how I saw myself, right, and how others were seeing me. And in a lot of ways, when we're talking about racial identity, that's exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about that liminal space between how you identify yourself and how others identify you. And I think for me, I realized, as I was moving further into like my later college and early grad school years, right, I saw other Black students around me, even family members around me who were in a lot of the same spaces, who were not succeeding for a lot of reasons that were around issues of race and racial identity. And I think for me, I realized that I was being socialized in a way that they were doing an intentional socialization to help me connect my sense of Blackness to a sense of strength, resilience, intelligence, a community that has been resilient in the face of a lot of things, right? And so I realized the importance of that messaging that I was getting through my parents, for sure, like 100%. Also through some of the media that I was consuming as a youngster, particularly hip hop, right? It was also giving me a lot of messaging around what we would call private regard. Like, how do you see yourself in the face of public regard, the problematic messages. So I just became fascinated with how, particularly Black folks and Black students in particular, but broadly, like how folks come to understand their racial identities, particularly in and around the context of schooling, and just became more and more fascinated with the growing research that showed that students particularly students of color with positive racial identities, were students who were doing better in schools, and thinking a lot more about what teachers or educators or researchers could be doing to create environments to leverage that relationship between positive racial identity development and positive school outcomes and experiences.
Yeah, and let's get into that. In a previous episode of the podcast, I had opportunity to talk with Lisa Harrison, who is professor of teacher education at Ohio University, and her research interest was focused on Black girls. And that conversation really opened my eyes to some of the dynamics of racial identity development that were specific to Black girls. You've done a fair bit of work on racial identity development for Black boys, and there's so many aspects to this, but let's maybe start with the intersection of racial identity and learning, which you alluded to. And I should mention that on this podcast, we are big proponents of looking at learning in both school context as well as out of school context. So maybe just start by sharing some of the big themes from your research around the role of racial identity in the learning process, and also the reverse, the ways that learning environments and teaching and learning practices affect racial identity development.
So I think what is important to consider is just the broad context, some of the, what I was talking about in terms of public regard, like the big, powerful messages in particular, and some of the structural issues, right, that are the sort of challenges that the Black students are facing in general from the beginning of the United States until now. There's the big ideas around the notion that Black folks are intellectually inferior, like problematic ideas that we all have to overcome. And then also some of the structural issues. Back in the day, it would have been, black folks being denied an education altogether legally, moving into a highly segregated education, and a somewhat, even pretty segregated education system that we see today. Also are sending messages to students about who they can and cannot be in and around school. And so that's the context, right? That's the thing that's going to be hard for us as adults to avoid, like that there are going to be these powerful messages that young folks are taking in one way or another. Now, what we can do, and it sort of alludes to what I was saying earlier about my own, journey, is that we can help young folks develop a sense of identity that both recognizes the challenges, right, that they're going to have to face, while also giving them a sense of agency that's rooted in a sense of understanding of being part of an ongoing sort of struggle, individually and collectively, to assert one's full humanity. So here's what happens. So in schools, and Dr. Teresa Perry does, and others, Dr. Vanessa Siddle Walker and others do great work around this. They talk about how in previously segregated schools, the educators at that time were hyper vigilant about making those schools spaces. It was really an identity-focused kind of education. They were really trying to say, hey, look, everybody out here doesn't think that any of us can do any of this. We are taking that notion and flipping it on its head. And in this space, we are asserting a reality that we know is true about ourselves, and we are going to produce excellence. And so what both Dr. Perry and Dr. Siddle Walker argue is that what's really odd is that when we desegregated schools, a lot of black teachers who were doing that work were not hired, and then B, the intentionality around focusing on the identity piece went away for a lot of students, including black students. And so now what happens? You have a grand narrative that says it doesn't matter what race you are, right? It doesn't matter, and it just matters about your effort. And it's hard not to buy into that narrative. So if you start to internalize that narrative, and if you're losing the intentionality around helping build that positive identity, you're leaving it to the students to fend for themselves. And now and now what happens is that you run the risk that the students are internalizing some of the things that are beyond their control. And maybe feeling helpless or at worst hopeless. So I think that's what happens with the status quo, right? That's when we don't do this work. So if we're just doing school ABCs and 1, 2, 3s for ABCs and 1, 2, 3's sake, in the context, black students in particular and other students of color are going to feel like, for me to be a good student is for me to overcome my blackness, right? In some ways, right? Which is a crazy thing to think. A lot of resistance for black students, black boys in particular, the resistance becomes to opt out of school or get pushed out. And there's ways, if you do this the right way, where the resistance starts to become in the form of achievement, to sort of prove people around them wrong, and also to be part of a broader and a longer movement to help our larger community.
No, totally. And I think it does really touch upon so many of the notes around early adolescent development. We talk about identity, you talked about agency. I heard lots of self-efficacy in there. And so those are some of the big sort of developmental themes that we concentrate a lot on early adolescence in the middle school years. Let's go deeper a little bit into critical consciousness. I feel like sometimes people can get turned off by terminology. The words themselves kind of get in the way. Let's just demystify this. What does critical consciousness mean in the education space?
Critical consciousness really just means the ability to recognize the forces that are shaping your life and then take action against them. Having, a sense of agency to be able to become an authentic author of your own future, right? And so I think that's how I would describe what critical consciousness is. And I think in the context of schools, that really means, in a lot of ways, things that a lot of educators have been doing all along. So what this is not about is and to be very blunt, this is not about shaming white folks and telling them that they're indelibly evil and racist, and the only way this will be solved is for them to go away. That is what this is not about, okay? What this is about helping folks, yes, understand the systems of power and privilege that have operated in the past, operate currently, and then to give ourselves the skill and the will to then be able to change it, to make the change, right? And I think what's beautiful about the United States and the history of the United States is that the history of the United States is just like many, many stories of like folks doing that very thing, right? Just seeing that, look, this isn't right. The way things are working out, whether it's intentional or not, isn't the right thing to do. And so let's figure out a way to make that happen. And sometimes it happens too slow, or sometimes it happens like monumentally fast. But that's what this country's about, and that's what makes it beautiful, because we produce all these beautiful things, right, in the face of trying to do all these things. And so I think, yes, it's about confronting those systems that we have to like tear down. And it's about like giving us the skill and the will to do something about it. So what it really boils down to is an analysis piece. Is that we have, in the research that my colleague and I, Dr. Scott Sider at Boston College, we did in our book, Schooling for Critical Consciousness, we break it down into 3 components. There's a social analysis component, which is like the ability to analyze these forces that are around us. There's a social action component, which is a wide range of activities that gives us and students in particular the opportunity to do something about any of this. And then our third one, which I think you'll really like in the context of this conversation, is this notion called political agency, which really is akin to, I think, self-efficacy, right? It's the belief that you can do something about these issues, right? Sometimes you might get all these action and analysis skills, and you may or may not at the end of that process feel like you can do anything about any of this. The goal, I think, really, to me, of those 3 is that sense of agency, and a sense of agency that's rooted in, a critical, sober analysis of what's going on, not a sense of agency that's rooted in something hokey or Pollyannish, right? But it's really about equipping students to understand these issues, do something about it, whether it's within the walls of their school or outside the walls of their school, and then ultimately, hopefully, to feel a sense of belief that they can then take that and move it out into the world.
I appreciate a lot of that. I come from central Pennsylvania, which is a very conservative part of the country, and I kind of feel like there are these dividing lines that people don't even understand, that they have some, it's not shared experience, but it's a common experience. Like a lot of the people where I come from came to this country because of religious persecution. And you can connect dots there to the experience of African Americans in this country and others in this country who have had similar sort of types of persecution, but people don't sort of see it in those terms. But I wonder if there are sort of ways to help people sort of understand what this is all about in ways that they themselves can kind of understand, because it's part of their personal narrative.
This is hugely important to me, and this is why I think to understand race, you have to understand history. There are many folks who today, right, are considered white, that when they arrived here as few as maybe 2 or 3 generations ago, were just not considered white. Or at least had a very distant experience with whiteness. So-called European ethnics, folks who were like Southern Europeans, Eastern Europeans, Irish folks, and usually on the basis of religion or language or ethnicity that really, because most of the white folks in the United States at the time, are white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. If you weren't, if you had different ethnicities, you had different language systems, or there was real questions about your ability to assimilate. And so when I learned that Irish folks were not considered white when they first arrived, like that was one of the most mind-blowing learnings in my life, because to me, like, just to be frank, like Irish folks were like the whitest white people that I could think of, right? And to hear that they were not considered white was a real education. And so all that to say is that there are many white folks whose experience, who have only been very recently in some ways experiencing any benefits or privileges of whiteness. That's understandable, and I think we have to have a better understanding of how these racial groups are dynamic. And then not to mention, of course, the ways that class are another really important identity that we don't talk enough or a lot about in the United States.
That was part 1 of my interview with Daren Graves. In part 2, we will talk about racial dimensions of school discipline practices, preparing teachers for a country that continues to evolve in its racial composition, and the role of hip-hop in learning. That's in just a moment on the Lessons in Adolescence podcasts, where we feature conversations with researchers, practitioners, program developers, and advocates for young adolescents in the middle school years. Recently, I spoke with Nadia Selby and Elizabeth Michi of Citizen Schools, a 25-year-old Boston-based nonprofit that offers middle school-age youth experiential learning opportunities through a blend of out-of-school time programming, in-school professional development, and community partnerships. Nadia is a veteran of the organization, having worked there for some 14 years, and is currently Vice President of Programs. Elizabeth is Managing Director of Catalyst, Citizen Schools' teacher development model. The driving force behind all of Citizen Schools' work is embedding experiential learning opportunities into the educational experience, both in school and out of school, which is a powerful way to keep youth in the middle grades engaged and on track.
What we felt within Citizen Schools as to why middle school is that age range to kind of really focus a lot of our energy on, it is because it's that make or break point. If a student really just stops getting excited about coming to school, they're not even making it to high school. By high school, they're dropping out. So what we wanted to focus on is how do you excite students and get them to understand what are the things within education that really connects to them and really pushes them forward. But in the same vein, we also want to make sure our educators understand how to excite our young people in these ways.
You can catch all of my conversation with Nadia and Elizabeth in a previous episode. And now, returning for part 2 of my conversation with Daren Graves. Let's go a little bit deeper into schools here. At the Remaking Middle School Initiative, part of our work is in schools, collaborating with educators and to bring more of the science of young adolescent learning and development into practice. And in that, we help educators identify problems of practice that they want to address that is specific to youth of this age. And on, I'll say, more than one occasion, the challenge that schools say that they struggle with is the outsized proportion of Black and brown boys who make up their discipline referrals. And I had a conversation with Laura Ross on this podcast previously, and she's a counselor in a middle school in Gwinnett County, Georgia, and she was National Counselor of the Year. And this was a situation that in many ways she was known for, and why she received that honor, because she saw this discrepancy in her own school and would not accept it as something inherent in the behavior of Black and brown boys, right? That there was something more to the environment, the setting, the perceptions, relationships, responses among the adults that was at play here. There's this concept of adultification, where Black boys particularly are perceived to be older than they are, and therefore the expectations put on them are out of sync with their developmental needs and their characteristics. You've examined variants of this phenomenon. Just tell us what you see is at play here, and maybe more importantly, what should we do about it? For these schools who are identifying this as an issue, as a problem of practice, how do they address it?
I think the best schools are doing this sort of at least on 3 levels, right? Or thinking about it. One, leadership that is prioritizing this work. You're not doing this work on an island, right? So that's the most important. Beyond that, I think there's a teacher side of the work, and I think there's a student side of the work too, okay? I think for the teacher side of things, yes, I think there's some work that we have to do as educators, and I've done this myself, but that we have to both do some internal work to fight against the powerful ideas about Black boys, the ways in which we tend to see them as older than they are, the ways in which we criminalize their bodies or make their bodies these things that we need to control, right? I've seen it happen. I've seen it happen in early elementary school, right? That gets exacerbated as we move especially into the early adolescent years. And it's really confusing in the early adolescent years, right? I happen to do a lot of work in a particular K-8 school, and it was just so fascinating and also heartbreaking to see some of the Black boys move from maybe even kindergarten all the way up until 6th and 7th grade, because they would start out as these cute, lovable little boys that everybody just adored, and then as they moved up, the ways in which the adults around them shifted their stance from these, lovable kids that, we wanted to help learn to these bodies that we had to control. So we have a lot of work to do, both in terms of thinking about how we're perceiving behavior in particular. I think sometimes well-intentioned teachers in unreflective moments do not have feel they have the capacity to deal with whatever behavior that they see happening with their black boy and just go get out, right? So I think some of it is about how we're perceiving behavior, but also I think some of it's about we have to do a better job in terms of how we're ushering our black boys through the academic part of the day as well, right? I think there's two things that happen. It's either a lack of support and scaffolding that we need to be giving them so that they can better access the material for a variety of reasons, like any other student of any race, or too often, which is the worst part, an underestimation of black boys' intellect. So they're bored, and we are, perceiving them as, oh, they're just misbehaving because they don't understand, right? And it's quite the opposite, right? And so I think we have a lot of work to do around how to give black boys constructive feedback academically. I have seen black men get all the way up into grad school. Who clearly have not been given the feedback that they need to work on, technical writing skills, for example. A fear of engaging the student, either because they don't believe the student can do better, or sometimes an apprehension about how to engage the student without seeming insensitive. So I've done a lot of boys groups with middle schoolers, and I think particularly with the 6th, 7th, 8th grade students, but a lot of work around sort of developing what I think Du Bois calls double consciousness. The notion of being able to see yourself through other people's eyes. What are the kinds of ways that you feel like you can comfortably help other folks see the you that you see?
Yeah, that's the agency piece, and agency is a skill. I mean, it's an asset, it's a trait, but it's also a skill that needs to be cultivated and learned and taught, and also practice. Where kids need to be able to have opportunities to practice. The demographics of this country are changing. Racially, we're becoming less white on the whole. There are some communities, a lot in the suburbs, actually. My wife teaches in a suburb of Chicago that has been historically white, affluent, and in the last maybe 10 or 15 years has a big influx of a Latinx community, and now makes up about a third of her students at least are now Latinx. So that's a rapid change. I mean, within 10 to 15 years of that demographic change, that's a lot, and a lot due to the influx of immigrants, but a lot from people who are exiting the city too, that are coming into the suburbs. Yet certainly in the education and youth development world, teachers and administrators are still predominantly white. It's different in different communities, of course, but the average, that is the case. Even in places like Chicago, where I live, the teaching corps is far more white than the student population is. So I'm curious, as you work with pre-service teachers at Simmons, what are the most important things that you want to instill in them as they go into this world of teaching that has these evolving dynamics with respect to race?
This is a dynamic that's playing out, I think, across the country in so many places, where teachers are sort of essentially waking up and realizing, like, the classroom they're teaching now is really different, like, demographically, than the classroom they were teaching 10, 15 years ago. I think what I've been trying to instill in teachers, and this is hard, right? Because I think, the traditional conception of teacher using Paulo Freire's language is sort of like the banking model of education, right? In other words, like, the teacher holds all the information. So the teacher is always the one who knows and is always in the position to then dole out knowledge at when and as they see fit or whatever. And so I think what then, causes that sort of cognitive dissonance of the teacher is that they're sort of realizing, wait, there's things I don't know. I used to know my students' families. I used to know their communities. I used to know so much that now I don't know. And that feels scary. As an educator, I can understand that feeling. And so I think one of the big things that I try and instill in, pre-service teachers is that sort of that Freirean Paulo Freire's sort of a reciprocal model of authority, rather than thinking of yourself as the doler out of the information and your students as these empty vessels. That the teaching process, especially if you want to make it like an equitable process, especially if you want to make it a process that will help folks not reproduce the systems that might be holding them back, is to recognize the expertise that young folks and that all folks bring to the classroom about their own lives and their own communities and their own conditions. I mean, that we as teachers may need to become students of, so as to become a better teacher of the things you want to teach. If you're teaching whatever subject you're teaching, you know, a lot of it is like, look, the curriculum is what it is, right? And you have to go through it. But you also want to figure out ways to make it relevant and like connections that the students can make to it, or understand some of the things that are happening outside of school. Broadly, if teachers felt more comfortable not knowing all the time, giving themselves opportunities, authentic opportunities for you to learn from the students in their communities.
At the end of the day, teachers and students are people first, and we all have those sort of dynamics, and that environment is very relational. It's, we have this sort of conception of this didactic, like you said, one-way transaction, but it's really kind of more of a relational process. I first learned about you from a presentation you did at Castle, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, at their most recent, what they call SEL Exchange. It's their national conference, which they held back in October, I believe. And I was really compelled by it. You put on a session in collaboration with a handful of young people who were involved in some civic causes that were personal or of interest to them. And, as we've been saying, for young adolescents in middle grades, in addition to identity development, is this concept of agency, young people taking ownership over their own path and being able to take part in and influence things that they care about. I would love for you to just tell us a little bit about that work, what you're doing with youth around civic engagement, and what you want to learn from it.
That was a wonderful opportunity. These were students from like all over the country, and so the folks at Castle were the ones who really got a chance to sort of find the young folks and bring us together. And again, it was just a real honor for me to learn about the kind of work that they're doing. Yes, very connected to their personal interests and lives. And so it's just always inspired me to see young folks do that, because I think that kind of work genuinely brings change to communities and to the country writ large. And so when to see that work happening at any level is inspiring to me. When you see young folks doing it, that's sort of a wake-up call, if anything, to us adults. Like, hey, come on, I could be doing some more. I think the work that I'm doing now around this is really about how to develop adult, educators to work with young folks to produce more outcomes like this. We have been engaged, Scott and I, engaged in a lot of work with many different schools and districts about helping them think about what this work could and should look like in their particular context. And we're also we're trying to do a deeper dive into a particular network of schools that is interested in utilizing a critical consciousness frame as part of their advisory period structure. We're in the process of delivering these year-long virtual professional learning communities with a group of schools across the country, including some schools in states where there are bans on allegedly some of this kind of work. And so, really trying to help educators deliver this kind of work to, their students' context across the country.
Yeah, I was just interested in the connections with what you were saying before about young people sort of understanding who they are, their place in the world, some of the structural things that are influencing them, but not as a stationary thing, something that they can actually do something about and they actually can take action on. And it's also the connection to SEL, which that's all about self-awareness and self-management and social awareness and relationship skills, and all of the SEL constructs are woven in there.
Agreed. And I think what's important about what you just said there is attend to the broad range of those 5 core competencies of SEL. I think what happens too often, particularly I think with students of color or schools that predominantly serve students of color, is that the SEL work focuses on one of those, and usually self-management. And so, I think it's about what we have seen and we continue to see at all levels, and when people are doing this work well, is folks integrating the analysis skills into core classes, right? Their math class, history, ELA, whatever it is. Giving students the opportunities to practice those skills, core classes, and then also either concurrent in the same class, or maybe when the school does it in a more scaffolded way in a later class or a subsequent class, scaffolded opportunities through school to practice the action skills. And those action skills, by the way, can be things like, yes, things that are happening outside of schools. And some of those things can be things that happen inside the walls of the community. Sometimes your school community is the audience. And by the way, for students, particularly middle school students, their school and their school community is the most meaningful place and community they have. And it may be the place that they need to make the most changes as it is. And so when they are given opportunities to make some changes to the school policies sometimes, or to have them be genuinely involved in the governance somehow, or given opportunities for students to teach other students about things that they're learning, those kinds of opportunities both give them practice engaging in the action and also help build those agency skills, because we'd hear a lot of students saying, oh, if I can make this change here, like i.e. in my school, I can start to make changes in other places.
Yeah, that's one of our biggest aspirations, is to have young people a part of the remaking of middle school. I think that's a really important piece of it. I can't let you go without talking about hip hop. Some people listen to it, you study it and listen to it. Beyond artistry, what is the utility of hip hop in educational settings?
Hip hop in my middle and high school was probably my second most influential teacher behind my parent. A big part of the sensibility, and it's even considered one of the core pillars of hip hop, is knowledge of self. So there's MCing, there's DJing, there's the graffiti, there's the b-boying, all in the purpose of knowledge of self. And so the hip hop that I grew up listening to, has evolved, right? But was very much, an exercise in critical consciousness. It was very much about putting up a counter narrative, especially in the mid 80s, late 80s, early 90s, grander narrative saying that, everything's getting better. And hip hop was sort of laying it down for us, saying, hey, like, things are so rough, man, we're struggling out here. They were all, and also allusions to historical figures and historical events that I was just not getting in school, right? And then a lot of the early MCs were like, they weren't just like, making records. They were like community activists. They were doing things in their own communities and other people's communities. So it was just like the music, yes, the beats, yes, right? The lyrics and the sensibilities and the dispositions of hip hop were very empowering to me as a young black man. It was also just one of those, it was almost like, the movie The Matrix. It's like one of those things where, like, when you start to see the world, it just sort of stripped away a world, and it just gave me that critical view of things. And so I think that's the sensibility that I think it brought to me. Hip hop and education have always been hand in hand to me in particular, particularly from a critical consciousness perspective. And I also think that hip hop is also, in terms of sensibility, it's always about pushing boundaries, making a way out of no way, the power of creating things together, the power of community. There are elements of hip hop, the cipher, that are really STEM focused, repurposing and using technology to make beautiful and amazing things. There's so much there, right? It's really about thinking about hip hop as a broader cultural phenomenon that young folks of many different races are completely into one way or another, right? Whether it's through fashion, whether it's through art, whether it's through the music, whether it's through the wordplay, it's all there.
Finally, Daren, if there was one bit of advice based on your research and your work with youth and training of teachers that you would offer to educators, both in school as well as in after school and in summer programs, of things they either ought to know or ought to be doing, what would it be?
My biggest advice, particularly for early adolescents, is to develop a sense of personal authority rather than positional authority. Positional authority is sort of a hierarchical authority relationship, right? It's like, do what I say because I'm the teacher. Do what I say because I'm the adult. Any of us who've worked 13 nanoseconds with early adolescents know that they're almost hardwired to resist against positional authority. They almost define themselves in opposition to your authority. Personal authority is rooted in a deep knowing and caring about the student and their family and their community, right? So that's more like, do this because I know this is going to help you do the things you want to do, and I know that you're able to do this, and I care about you and your community's goals and outcomes moving forward. And so I think in summer programs, even in our school years, we feel like we have very limited time to get through a lot of material. Build in time to develop authentic relationship with your students, all of them.
Daren, this has been such an engaging conversation. I really appreciate you and all of the work that you're doing and the contributions you're making to the field. So thank you so much.
This is my pleasure. Thank you. This was great. Thank you.
That was Daren Graves. You can follow Daren is spelled with one R, on Twitter @Daren Graves. Thanks for joining the Lessons in Adolescence podcast, a production of Remaking Middle School, an initiative that seeks to transform the learning and development experience for young adolescents in the middle school years. Remaking Middle School brings together good educational practice in school and out of school with the latest developmental science. You can learn about Remaking Middle School or find more resources about the topics of this podcast on the web at remakingmiddleschool.org. Or learn more about the founding partner organizations, the University of Virginia's Youth-Nex Center on the web at education.virginia.edu/youth-nex, N-E-X, or on Twitter at youth_nex, and the Association for Middle Level Education on the web at amle.org or on Twitter at AMLE. The Lessons in Adolescence podcast is produced by Abby Gillespie and me, Jason Cascarino. Editing by Paige Waterhouse. You can listen to or download each episode at the Remaking Middle School website, on Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts. Thanks for listening.